Welcome to another episode where we look at history and culture through the lens of beer. Today we're cracking open a particularly intriguing topic, the surprising connection between beer and the church. You might think of monks solely devoted to wine. But get ready for a twist. We're going to explore how beer actually earned a place of approval even for use in the Eucharist. We're basing our deep dive today on a fascinating paper from the Journal of Medieval Monastic Studies. It's called Celtic and Egyptian Beer Production Traditions and the Origins of Western European Monastic Brewing.
That's right. And the story starts by debunking a common myth. Many people believe that large-scale brewing originated in monasteries around the 12th or 13th centuries. However, evidence suggests that organized brewing was happening long before that. We even have evidence of a brewing society, known as the Ars Cerveceria, dating back to the Roman period in Trier, Germany.
So beer was already a part of the cultural landscape, centuries before monasteries became known for it. What's fascinating is that the roots of beer brewing in Europe go even deeper, connecting to the ancient Celts.
Yes, and the Celts were true innovators when it came to beer. They were hopping their brews as far back as the 6th century BC. That's over 1,000 years before hops appear in any monastic brewing records. They might have even been using barrels for beer before the Romans did.
It's amazing to think that some of the techniques we associate with modern brewing have such ancient origins. And the Celts' influence didn't stop there. They even used the word brassis for malt, a term that later found its way into monastic brewing terminology. It really highlights the continuity of brewing traditions across different cultures and time periods.
Speaking of traditions, the very first beer-drinking monks were actually in Egypt. These early monasteries were all about self-sufficiency, working to provide for their own needs, and even donating any surplus they produced. You might assume that meant they were all about winemaking, but surprisingly, beer was also part of their repertoire.
That is surprising. You'd think with all that sunshine they'd be focused on grapes. But wait, if beer was already present in Egyptian monasteries, why don't we hear more about it? I mean, the famous monastic rules of Pachomius and Benedict don't even mention beer.
That's a great observation, and it points to a fascinating shift in attitudes towards beer over time. While early Egyptian monks brewed and drank beer, the beverage doesn't appear in any of their written guidelines. In fact, prominent figures like St. Jerome and St. Augustine, who helped shape early Christian thought, actually advised against beer, viewing it as a less desirable alternative to wine.
So even though beer was there from the beginning, there seemed to have been a preference for wine, especially as the church developed under Roman influence.
You could say that. Early church writings sometimes even labeled beer as a pagan drink. But the story takes another turn as we look north to the Irish monks. Unlike their Egyptian counterparts, the Irish didn't have much of a tradition of viticulture. Growing grapes for wine just wasn't practical in their climate.
It's no surprise that grapes aren't exactly flourishing in the Emerald Isle.
Exactly. So the Irish monks embraced beer wholeheartedly, and their affinity for it had a major impact on the spread of beer brewing throughout Europe. It's believed that they introduced beer drinking, and possibly even the use of barrels to monasteries in continental Europe.
So the Irish monks brought their love of beer with them as they traveled and established new monastic communities. What's interesting is that they seem to have a more relaxed attitude towards beer than some of the earlier church founders.
Their lighthearted approach is evident in some of the stories associated with them. For example, there's a tale about Saint Cronan, an Irish abbot who supposedly had the power to magically speed up the fermentation process, so his guests could enjoy a quicker pint. Or perhaps get a little tipsy faster. It shows a more playful side of monastic life.
It definitely paints a different picture from the image of monks solely focused on piety and austerity. So even though early on there seemed to be a preference for wine, beer had a strong foothold thanks to the Irish monks. But did the church ever officially acknowledge beer's place?
Yes, the Carolingian monastic reforms of the 9th century, though largely based on the Benedictine rules, officially recognized beer in a rather practical way. You see, these reforms declared that in places where wine wasn't easily available, monks could drink twice as much beer as their usual wine ration.
Twice as much. That's quite a change. But I guess it makes sense. If they were used to a certain amount of wine, they'd need more beer to achieve a similar effect.
It's a fascinating insight into how practical considerations shaped monastic rules. And interestingly, this acceptance of beer seems to have coincided with the adoption of another key brewing element, hops. Evidence suggests that monasteries in northern France and Belgium started hopping their beers around the 9th century.
So while the Celts pioneered hopping, It was the monasteries that really embraced and popularized it. It seems like a lot was happening with beer in the 9th century. We have official recognition and the spread of hopping, all while these earlier church figures seemed hesitant about beer. It makes you wonder, how did beer ultimately earn a place in such a sacred ritual as the Eucharist?
That's a question that takes us right to the heart of beer's role in the church. To understand how it found its way into the Eucharist, we need to consider what the Eucharist represents. It's a central ritual in Christianity, symbolizing the Last Supper where Jesus shared bread and wine with his disciples.
And the wine, of course, represents the blood of Christ. So to use beer instead of wine in such a sacred ritual seems like a pretty significant departure from tradition.
It was, but it also highlights the church's ability to adapt to different circumstances. As we've discussed, wine wasn't always readily available, especially in those regions where beer was already a staple drink. For those monasteries, beer became a practical and symbolic substitute.
It makes sense that practicality would play a role. But was there a specific moment when beer got the official nod for the Eucharist? Like a decree or proclamation?
Interestingly, there isn't a clear-cut historical document outlining beer's official acceptance for the Eucharist. It seems to have been a gradual process driven by necessity and evolving attitudes towards beer. As beer became more integrated into monastic life, and as its production became more sophisticated, it slowly gained acceptance as a suitable alternative, especially in regions where wine was scarce or difficult to obtain.
So it was more about local customs and practical needs, rather than a top-down decree from the church hierarchy. I imagine this shift wasn't without its critics, though. Were there people who opposed using beer in the Eucharist?
Absolutely. There were those who held onto the traditional view that wine was the only appropriate beverage for such a sacred ritual. They argued that beer lacked the biblical precedent of wine, and some even considered it a less refined drink, unworthy of such a holy purpose. Think back to those early church figures who saw beer as less desirable than wine.
It sounds like there was a real tension between tradition and practicality. But despite those reservations, beer ultimately found its place in the Eucharist in some regions. What does that tell us about beer's overall acceptance within the church?
It's a testament to beer's growing importance in certain parts of the church. The fact that it was incorporated into such a central ritual suggests that. Despite some initial resistance, beer eventually came to be seen as more than just a common drink. It became a symbol of spiritual nourishment. And its acceptance in the Eucharist reflects the church's capacity to adapt and evolve over time.
It's fascinating how something as simple as a drink can carry such deep symbolic meaning, and even spark debate within religious traditions. We've seen how practical needs, cultural preferences, and changing perceptions all contributed to beer's journey into the Eucharist. But what about the impact of monastic brewing beyond the walls of the monastery?
That's where we see the social and economic influence of these brewing monks. They weren't just making beer for their own consumption. They were becoming key players in the development of brewing as an economic force.
So in a way, they were like the craft brewers of their time. Did they sell their surplus beer to the surrounding communities?
In many cases, yes. They would sell or barter their beer, contributing to the local economy, and even shaping the social fabric of their communities. Remember those 3 breweries in the St. Gall plan we mentioned earlier?
Yes. It's hard to imagine a monastery with 3 breweries. What did that signify?
It highlights just how important beer production had become for some monasteries. Those breweries weren't small operations. They were complex and sophisticated, capable of producing significant quantities of beer. It shows that brewing wasn't just a way to make a drink, it was an integral part of their economic activity.
So these monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic hubs as well. It makes you wonder how they balanced their religious life with their brewing endeavors.
It was a balancing act for sure. Some criticized monasteries for being too focused on worldly affairs, claiming they were straying from their spiritual mission.
It's interesting to consider how the monks reconciled their economic activities with their spiritual pursuits. Did they use the profits from brewing to support their communities or fund other projects?
Absolutely. Many monasteries use the income generated from brewing to support charitable works, maintain their buildings, and even fund the construction of new structures. It was a way to put their brewing skills to good use for the benefit of others.
So their brewing wasn't just about profit, it was about serving their communities and furthering their mission. It's a great example of how economic activity can be aligned with spiritual values.
It also speaks to the ingenuity of the monks. They weren't simply following recipes. They were constantly experimenting, developing new techniques, and refining their brewing processes. They played a crucial role in spreading the knowledge of brewing throughout Europe. Think back to those Irish monks who introduced beer making to other regions.
Right. And that story about Saint Cronan magically speeding up fermentation shows they weren't afraid to have a little fun with it either.
Their innovations and dedication to their craft laid the groundwork for what we see in the beer world today. In many ways, they were pioneers of the craft brewing movement, which often emphasizes quality ingredients, traditional techniques, and a strong sense of community.
So the next time we raise a glass of our favorite craft beer, we can appreciate the legacy of those early brewing monks, who not only quenched their thirst, but also shaped the cultural and economic landscape of their time.
And we can appreciate how even something as seemingly simple as beer can tell us so much about history, religion, and the evolution of human ingenuity.
It's a reminder that there's always more to discover in the world of beer, from its ancient origins to its modern incarnations. If you've enjoyed this journey through the fascinating connection between beer and the church, be sure to subscribe and join us next time as we explore another intriguing chapter in the history of this beloved beverage.